brace yourself and bear with me. I'm going to try to digest 14 centuries here. Of course, it all starts with Muhammad. For about a decade, Muhammad was a preacher in Mecca. The Meccan verses are the ones that the apologists love to quote because they have a veneer of tolerance to them. That was because he was completely outnumbered. And then the pivotal moment, of course, comes at Hijra, the migration. And then in Medina, he became technically a political warlord. To me, the genius of Muhammad, I often say this, is that he took the tribal mores of his time, 7th century Arabia, which was immensely tribal, and he deified them. He re-articulated them through a theological paradigm. The tribe was no longer blood kin. It was the believers. It was the ummah. You win more because you go to heaven and you get the Ain Hor, the 72, dark-eyed, black-eyed virgins created for the express purpose to gratify Allah's favorites in perpetuity. This man's entire appeal is to appeal to the basest instinct of his followers by allowing them to kill and plunder and rape, and at the same time feel like you're holy for doing that.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of my Islam in the West series on the Yasmine Mohammad podcast. Thank you so much for joining us here today and for hopefully listening through the rest of this series, which is going to focus on, as the title would suggest, Islam and the West. So we're going to start at the very beginning today. We're starting with a very important man who I'm very grateful was able to start off this podcast series with me, Raymond Ibrahim. So Raymond is an expert in Islamic history and doctrine. He's a widely published expert in the Middle East and Islam. He's the author of many books, including Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. So exactly the topics that we're going to be talking about in this series. Ibrahim's dual background, born and raised in the US by Egyptian parents who were born and raised in the Middle East, has provided him with unique advantages, from equal fluency in English and Arabic to an equal understanding of the Western and Middle Eastern mindsets. So you can see why I said if I had a magic wand, I couldn't have conjured up a better guest to start off this series right on the ground floor to give us a history of Islam, how did it start, and to bring us as much as possible to here to today and to show us all of the connecting threads. Raymond, welcome. Welcome to the first episode of Islam in the West.
Thank you, Yasmine. I'm very happy to be with you. Sounds like a good endeavor you got going.
Yes, I hope so. And thank you again for being here with us to start us off. So I was reading through your book, the one that I just mentioned, Sword and the Scimitar, and you did a lot of unpacking Islam, as the subtitle says, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. But what I want you to do today is give us, as much as you can, as concise as possible, a history of Islam. So people see what's happening today in the West, but they may not recognize these common threads that I was talking about, these very deep-seated threads leading back 1400 years. So I'm hoping you can tell us the history of how Islam started, specifically referring to Hijra, and what that means and why it's so significant to the spread of Islam.
Sure. So brace yourself and bear with me. So I'm going to try to digest 14 centuries here. And of course, it all starts with Muhammad. And that's where the Hijra comes from. Hijra, of course, is year 1 in the Islamic calendar. And it corresponds to the year in the Western calendar or the Christian calendar, 622. But of course, you can't just add it together because they go by the lunar calendar as well. At any rate, Muhammad, before that point, had been preaching.
And the word Hijra means? To migrate, basically. Okay. So before that event, for about a decade, Muhammad was a preacher in Mecca. And of course, this is a polytheistic time. The Arabs overwhelmingly were what you would call pagans. And his message was not well received. And this is, if you want to know what he said, it's basically
in the Quran, but it is what's considered the Mecca phase. And unfortunately, the Quran's not outlined in a chronological order. So you have to actually have some understanding which one is Mecca, which one comes later, Medina. But at any rate, the Meccan verses are the ones that the apologists love to quote because they have a veneer of tolerance to them. They're the ones where Muhammad talks about, you have your religion, I have mine. There is no coercion in religion, etc., etc. And so that's Muhammad during Mecca. Now, of course, that was because he was completely outnumbered. He didn't. In those 10 years, the only people who believed in his prophethood were relatives, close relatives, and the number over a decade didn't grow to maybe more than 100. So he was outnumbered, and he was in no position to actually go on the offensive. And again, that's why you get those verses. And then the pivotal moment, of course, comes the Hijra, the migration, where he's invited to Yathrib, which we know today as Medina, the city of light. And he's invited there. There were a lot of Jews living there as well as Arabs. And the long and short of it is he becomes a political authority. So that's the shift. He went from an itinerant sort of harmless preacher in Mecca. And then in Medina, he became technically a political warlord. Okay. And this is where, so now in Medina, a lot of the revelations, as they call them, of the Quran, the verses that came to him at that time, these now become more militant. Okay, and they ultimately culminate with all-out offensive warfare against pagans and also Christians and Jews. Keep in mind, when he went to Medina, after the Hijra, there was a covenant that he actually created with those people, the Jews and the Arabs, and it was a sort of a pact of cooperation. But eventually, as he got stronger, that was also abrogated, and he turned on them. And of course, we know of all the sort of horrific attacks on the Jews, the Beni Qurayza, I think, whom he had beheaded. So the point of the Hijra and the blueprint is, it's a migration, it's a consolidation, it's a growth of power, and slowly you spread out. So once he had acquired enough power in Medina, then he went on the offensive. So now you get the verses, the most famous of which in Arabic's Ayat al-Sayf, which means the sword verse, and that's 9:5, which basically it says, we'll lay in wait for the polytheists, the idolaters, the pagans, wherever you can find them, and kill them and besiege them and take them hostage. Okay, so that was, according to a lot of Muslim exegetes, that verse alone abrogated something over 100 peaceful verses. Because also Muslims go by this abrogation, of course, al-nasikh wal-mansukh, is this idea that the verses, the revelations that were revealed to Muhammad over all those years, the reason they contradict what, we already pointed out. Some say, there's tolerance and you have your religion and I have my religion. And then you have these other ones which say, no, all out warfare. Another pivotal one is 929, which says, fight the people of the book, who Muslims understand to be Jews and Christians, the scriptuaries, as they call them, until they pay jizya, which means tribute, and live essentially a second class, and the verse says, and they have to pay tribute and feel themselves humbled. Okay, so, and that's a whole other thing, which is, that's the bedrock idea behind what we call dimitude, or the dhimma, where you can live as a Christian or Jew under Islamic rule, but you are at best a second-class citizen. You don't have much rights, etc. We can get into that later. But so all of that is what comes out during the Medina phase, the later phase. And because it's the later phase, it's believed to have abrogated all the earlier ones. Okay, and then the earlier ones are seen as essentially, when Muslims find themselves in that position, then they can actually adhere to those verses. So if you're a Muslim living in America, and obviously you're outnumbered, then you become like Muhammad in Mecca. And now you can preach peace, and you can, use that blueprint. And I'll share with you a funny anecdote. When I worked at the Library of Congress, which had a significant Muslim population, because of course, Washington, D.C. is very diverse and multicultural, there was a Muslim man who I worked very closely with, and we had a kind of tense but also friendly relationship because he knew I knew what he was all about, and it was kind of funny. But we would have at one point we had this entire. I said what I just told you, okay, about the abrogation and this and that, and because he kept insisting, no, the Quran has the good verses and we need to follow them always. And then when I explained to him all this and saying, well, what about abrogation? What about the militant verses, etc.? And I said, well, those verses only apply to Mecca when you're weak and outnumbered. So he got frustrated and said, well, I live in America. That is Mecca. So of course his point was, yeah, I'm employing those verses because I'm in that situation. I'm outnumbered. I'm weak. And of course the understanding is if that changes, then he goes to the Medina verses. Okay. So this is a well understood doctrine, this sort of evolution. And if you read Arabic, I know you do, it's always spelled out by Muslim exegetes and Islamic scholars. In the modern era, Sayyid al-Qutb, of course, he really systematized this idea and, showed all the Quranic verses and also from the Hadith and the Sirah, how everything kind of fit into these the patterns of evolution. And so at any rate, that's the idea. And once he went to Medina and he became stronger, and then we get the violent verses, then he went on the war path and eventually conquered Mecca, okay, and most of Arabia until he died in 632. And then his successors, the caliphates as we call them, then Abu Bakr during the so-called Ridda wars against the apostates, he brought them all to heel. And now Islam essentially governed Arabia. Okay, so now, and this is the point where it gets interesting now for me, because what I've discussed is it really borders on doctrine, and it's very important, of course. But I think there's a great lacuna for the people who, like us, or the people who in the anti-jihadist movement, as it's called. They very much focus on what we just described, but they don't understand how it was put into practice historically. Okay, and so it unfortunately becomes an abstract idea, and this is why apologists who would argue against, let's say, you or me, will say something like, well, just because it's in scriptures doesn't mean Muslims did it. And then there's this idea that historically Muslims didn't do this. They were actually the good guys and the Christians were the bad guys. So it becomes, they use the same, they'll tell you, like, look at the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures. Look at all the violence in them. The wars of extermination that Joshua, for example, engaged in. And just because it's written in that book doesn't mean this is exactly what you have to do today. So this is one of the arguments. And this is why it was important for me to show that, okay, so let's look at the history. Let's see, did it reflect? Was it a manifestation of this doctrine, or is it different? Now, of course, if you talk to your average historian, Western academic, who are essentially indoctrinated and bred into the very apologetic, pro-Islamic, anti-Western, they will tell you, no, of course, Islam historically was a glorious force of advancement and progress, Andalusia, the glories of Abbasid Baghdad, et cetera, et cetera. So that book that you mentioned, Sword and Scimitar, is actually a product of 20 years of research and study that goes back to my college days. In my master's thesis, which I completed in 2001, was the Battle of Yarmouk, which was the first pivotal battle, and that actually became chapter 1 of my book. But I had continued doing lots of research, and I got a lot of my sources when I was working at the Library of Congress. So that was definitely advantageous, because a lot of the sources are very hard to find, including in Arabic. There were a lot of sources there. At any rate, so now let's encapsulate what happened once the jihad exploded on Christendom, essentially. So, so the first corrective. Most people don't understand that in the 7th century, we're talking about now, which is when Muhammad dies and the jihad begins. Basically, the first attacks now on infidels, Christians, start around 634, 636. And the pivotal battle, which I mentioned, would be the Battle of Yarmouk. And it's against the Christians of the north living in Syria, who are the Byzantines, what we call the Byzantines, or essentially the successors of the Roman Empire.
Sorry, Raymond, I'm just going to interrupt you for one moment. You did use the word jihad a couple times, and I wanted you to just stop for a moment and just give us a little bit of a definition of the word jihad, please.
Sure. So the word jihad, it comes from, as you know, probably in Arabic, they're all based on triliteral roots, consonants, and it's actually a very analytical language, Arabic, unlike other languages, which is basically you have 3 consonants, and then depending on where the vowels go, before, in the middle, or whatever, you get various words that are all interrelated. So, for example, Mecca, MKT, okay, or no, MKB, MKT. You can turn that into mekteb, means desk, mektaba, library, katib, an author, kitab, book. Okay. And this is important to understand. So when we talk about the word jihad, so the word jihad really comes from the three-letter roots, JHD, okay? And what they mean literally is to strive, to struggle, okay? So if I use it in a verb, and again, depending on where the vowels would go, if I'm engaged in jihad, I'm striving, I'm struggling. But then it became its own word, jihad, al-jihad, okay? And so in its root, it means, of course, to struggle or to strive for something, some righteous cause. But in its practice, it meant holy war. And this is why
Well,
when you look at...
I like to remind people, I like to equate it with Mein Kampf, which means my struggle as well.
Yeah, I wrote an article about exactly that about 18 years ago on NRO, comparing the word Mein Kampf, my struggle, with my jihad. And so on the one hand, it's important to remember that when when you translate an Arabic word, it's fair to translate it not necessarily into its literal meaning, in this case, strive or struggle, but into it, into the connotation, not the denotation. And so the connotation amongst Muslims, when you said the word jihad, it meant holy war. It meant warfare on the infidel. And so in that sense, it was fair for early Orientalists of the 19th century and so forth, when they came across this little foreign word, jihad. Now it's popular, so we can say jihad. But when they came across it, they translated it into holy war, because that's what it really meant. So in the writings of the jurists and the historians in the period that I'm going to discuss, post-Muhammad and well into the centuries of conquest against Europe, jihad, I like how you actually pronounce it in Arabic, but I'm so caught up. I always pronounce things like in American, I say Muslim instead of Muslim. I say jihad instead of jihad. Okay, so I need to be cognizant of that. Yeah. So basically, now here's the interesting thing. So that's what it meant historically: warfare against the kafir, the infidel, right? And that's why it's perfectly legit to translate it into holy war. Now, what's interesting is the Muslim apologists and Western apologists will argue with someone like me and say, see, you even admit it. It means struggle. It doesn't mean holy war. It could mean anything. The problem with this interpretation is it actually makes it worse for Muslims. It makes the issue actually more the danger involved is actually more subtle. So what they're saying is, no, it doesn't mean holy war. It means struggle, strive. Well, okay, but we all know that it's in the context of struggling and striving on behalf of empowering Islam, according to the vision which is in the Quran, that Islam must govern the entire world. It's definitely in the Sharia worldview. Okay, so when you say that, when you say it really means strive, that makes it worse. And it makes sense of what's happening today. Because historically, to struggle, to do jihad, meant warfare. Because you're not going to get a Christian or a European or whoever to submit through subterfuge or through propaganda or through indoctrination or through playing the victim. The only way you were going to beat them is on the field of battle. So that's why it meant that. Today, however, it is in fact a struggle that is manifesting itself in many different subtle ways. And so amongst Muslim jurists today, they will talk about, and I'm giving you the English translations, they'll say jihad of the womb, or the baby jihad. They'll talk about, which is basically, I am struggling, I'm working on behalf of Islam by having as many children as I can, whether I'm a woman or a man, impregnating, okay? And you see this obviously happening in Europe. There is jihad of the pen and jihad of the tongue. This is propaganda, okay? Oh, I am striving on behalf of Islam, but I'm doing it by whatever, deception, through propaganda, through apologetics, through lies. There's jihad al-mal, okay? Money, the money jihad. I'm not committed to the jihad. I'm a rich Saudi, but I spend millions on the cause. I give it to terrorist groups. Okay, and there's all kinds, we can get into that. So the fact that it actually means to struggle and strive makes it worse. And it just shows you how multi-tentacled it really is. Historically, like I said, it's warfare, and it still is warfare. That is its primary connotation. That's what, when you read an Islamic, in Arabic juridical text, jihad means war. Okay, but now that we're in this very interesting stage, it has sort of morphed back to its original meaning of being struggling in any way possible. So that's what we're having. Is that sufficient? Shall I continue with the historical?
No, this is great. I think just to summarize everything you've said till now, I'm just going to read a quote from your book where you said, Muhammad had only won over some 100 followers after a decade of peaceful preaching in Mecca, but nearly the whole of Arabia after a decade of successful raiding. So
Right.
I think that just encapsulates both the importance of Hijra and the importance of jihad. So the successful raiding,
Right.
the raping and pillaging, that's what allowed Islam to spread so successfully. So jihad is incredibly important in Islam. It's, as you were just mentioning, um, to jihad fi sabilillah. So that means to this struggle or this fight for Allah, to spread Islam generally. That's what it means. Again, you talk in your book about how, and this is something I've learned, and every Muslim growing up anywhere in the world has also learned, that in order to use your life, to lose your life in the endeavor of jihad is the best way to spend your life, because then we go ahead after that and start to talk about all of the rewards that people get for losing their life in the endeavor of jihad. Lining up for battle in the path of Allah, Muhammad said, is worthier than 60 years of worship. And when they engage in this jihad, their gift or their reward is, of course, the highest levels of heaven and all of these wonderful things in heaven that they can't get on earth. And one of those things that's, you know, um, illustrated to them in such detail is how they're going to get these Hur al-Ain, how they're going to. So that's the next question that I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to talk to you about what are these Huris? What are these celestial perpetual virgins that are going to be gifted to successful jihadis? And how has that, corrupted the minds of these men? And how did that contribute to millions of Western women being taken as slaves in the Arab world?
So before I answer that, because what you just said actually reminded me of something very important, which will lead to the Huri question. So I'll just unpack something very close, very related to that. And if I missed that, Ayn Hur, please remind me.
Okay.
But the idea, which you quoted earlier about, the 10 years he had no followers, 100, and then it grew. So why is that? And it's because if you really, to me, the genius of Muhammad, I often say this, is that he took the tribal mores of his time, 7th century Arabia, which was immensely tribal, and he deified them, or he re-articulated them through a theological paradigm. Okay, and so what happened is tribalism, as we know, especially 7th century Arabian tribalism, is so extreme. It's basically, we, the tribe, are humans. You, who are not part of my tribe, are the enemy. You are free game. If I come across you and you're not my tribe, I can kill you, rape you, enslave you. That's absolutely fine. Okay, and so Muhammad sort of took that, but again, like I said, re-articulated it in a theological paradigm. And now it was no longer, the tribe was no longer blood kin. It was the believers. It was the ummah, which really does begin in Medina. And everyone else became outside the tribe, became the enemy. Okay, so this is another way of looking at why the infidel is the enemy, because he's outside of the tribe, and until he submits and becomes part of it, we can kill him, raid him, rape, plunder, etc. But at the same time, because it's infused with a theological idea, it became even more powerful, because now I can go raid the infidel, the outsider, and I can take his women and his children and his blood and his wealth. Okay. But now if I die doing that, I go to heaven and I get the same thing, even more of it, more women,
Win-win.
more pleasure, because it's a very hedonistic paradise. So in many ways, what Muhammad did is he just, like I said, took this tribalism, but turned it into what I call the win-win strategy, which is now like old tribalism or secular tribalism. It's warfare and you get what you get, but you also might die. But now if you die, you win. You win more, because you go to heaven and you get the Ain Hor, the 72, they translate them as, dark-eyed, black-eyed virgins, who are essentially supernatural sex women who were created for the express purpose to gratify Allah's favorites in perpetuity. Okay, I mean, it's insane. And the very earliest critics of Islam, John of Damascus, who lived in the 7th century, this is what, or Theophanes, this is what they would point out. They would say, this is just, disgusting. This man's entire appeal is to appeal to the basest instinct of his followers by allowing them to kill and plunder and rape, and at the same time feel like you're holy for doing that. And if you die, you actually go to heaven. So it was a very strong, appeal that this is why when he was just preaching peace, he got no followers. And when he went to Medina and went on the warpath, they started to grow exponentially. And with each new conquest, which we'll get into, they grew exponentially. And as far as the Ainhor that we discussed, the Houris, which I also always find funny, because I wonder if the English word whore is sort of etymologically based on Huri, because we do have a lot of English words that come back from Arabic words like assassin, which comes from the Hashashin, which is an Islamic group. But at any rate, so, and it's interesting because when you read these, and I quote them in the book, when you read about Muslims dying on the field of battle, they supposedly see the Houris coming down and welcoming them, with their open arms, and it comes out. Now, the funny thing is, this isn't just, or not, it's not funny, maybe sad. This isn't just stuff of history, because until this very day, there's quotes of Muslims who are suicide bombers who talk about how they're doing this and they're going to be rewarded by the warm embraces of the Houris, okay, who, like I said, are even in the Quran depicted as being very large bosomed, and I mean, they're just basically like sex dolls. Okay. So that's who they are. And in many ways, of course, this is what has also caused Muslims to sexually objectify all women, because if that's part of the doctrine, and I know you were asking me about the sexual enslavement, but I suppose I can mention that during the context of the jihad on Europe. And if you'd like, I can proceed with that.
Yes, please. Okay. Please keep going. Yeah.
Okay, so we left off sort of, Arabia has been consolidated under the first Caliph Abu Bakr, and then under the second Caliph, Omar bin al-Khattab, which is starting around 644, which is when, 634, when Abu Bakr dies. This is when the real jihad explodes on the regions adjacent to Arabia now. And they were overwhelmingly Christian. And this is what so many people don't understand. When you talk about 7th century, when you talk about the rise of Muhammad and the subsequent jihad, what we today are so casually call the Islamic world was actually the heart of the Christian world. Okay, so Greater Syria, as it was known, which today encompasses Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, the Palestinian regions, and all the way up north, it was Greater Syria. That was one of the, if not the oldest Christian region. Okay, so was Egypt. So was all the way, you go to Morocco or Maghreb. And the point is, they weren't just Christian. They were literally more Christian than the West. Okay, think of it as this way: there were 5 C's, as they call them, major Christian centers. Only one was in the West, Rome. Okay, the other 4 were in the East, and this would be Alexandria, it would be Antioch, it would be Jerusalem, and later Constantinople. And those 4 all got conquered and swallowed up by Islam. And the only one that was left was actually Rome. And I always marvel at how people don't understand that, during this time, this was a Christian, heavily Christian region. The reason Constantine moved the capital of Rome from Rome to Nova Roma, New Rome, or Constantinople, it's named after him, which is far in the east. It's actually today in Turkey, is because that's where Christendom was. That's where the more sophisticated, the more learned, the richer part of the Christian world was. And in 1 century, during these jihads that I'm discussing, they were all conquered. Okay, so all of Greater Syria, all of Egypt, all of North Africa. And the reason I say 1 century is Muhammad dies in 632. 732, now you have the Battle of Tours or Poitiers, which is right in the middle of France. Okay, so that is how much territory the Muslims conquered, all of which was Christian, until they got to the middle of France. They also, incidentally, of course, conquered Persia, which was Zoroastrian at the time, and they also went further east and conquered India and further. And the bloodbaths there are especially horrific, especially the Indians, because they were seen as pagans. So their blood is immediately halal. They can kill you outright. But so, and this is why it's, I know you're half Egyptian, half Palestinian. Your ancestors far back are probably a Coptic and Egyptian, and a Christian Palestinian. The word Copt, all it means is Egyptian. Our word Egyptian comes from the Greek Egyptos, and the Arabs came in and called all those people who were Christians Gipt. They cut off the beginning and the end, so it's not Egyptos, it's just Gipt, and then it became Kipt, and now it's in English it's Copt, and it just essentially meant an Egyptian who, of course, was a Christian at the time. So unfortunately, none of this is being taught in academia. I've looked at school books, textbooks. Parents send me, what their kids learn, and you get one very hygienic sentence about how through trade Islam spread. Okay, but if you look at this century that I'm talking about, and it's in my book, Sword and Scimitar, I think 3 chapters are just based on that first century. It's just constant warfare, destruction of churches, slaughter of Christians and other people. The Berbers, especially in North Africa, had it horrifically. Mass slavery, tens of thousands of people. And then they went into Europe, in Spain in the year 711, and essentially it fell and was conquered, except for a small quadrant in the northwest, where the Reconquista actually started. We can get into that. And then, like I said, a few years later, they had penetrated France, and they were finally stopped there. Okay, but it didn't end there. And then, there was a sort of transitional period. Now you have the rise of the Turks, and the Arabs begin to wane. And then the Turks start pouring in, and they become the new standard bearers of the Jihad, and it gets launched again. And now they're in the Balkans now. And this is what the worst time is when the Turks really came. It got really bad. And actually, even before that, the one that I like to cite, just to give you an idea of both how Christian the Middle East was and both the persecution that Christians experienced. In the year 1009, the Fatimid, Egypt, a lot of people don't know, was actually governed for a couple of centuries by Shias. That's what the Fatimids were. But the Fatimid Caliph, Hakim Ba'amr Allah, actually destroyed, according to al-Makrizi, an Arabic Muslim historian, 30,000 churches in both Egypt and Greater Syria. So again, this underscores just how profoundly Christian that region was and how profound the persecution was in 1 year. He also ordered the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre, okay, which is the most important church in Jerusalem for Christians, because it's believed to be built on the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. That was completely razed to the ground. And it's that sort of thing. And pilgrims who were coming from Europe were being attacked and killed, and very horrific stuff. There's a story, in a contemporary story, of a German nun who, because she was so attractive, the Turks took her and gang raped her until she died. Okay, and then the chronicler, and it's in Sword and Scimitar if you want the source, and the chronicler says, and they did this often. Okay, and that is the buildup for the First Crusade, which otherwise we are often presented with in a vacuum. Okay, I've quoted him before. We have historians and academics like John Esposito of Georgetown University, where I went over 2 decades ago, who literally says, before the First Crusade, everything for centuries was peace and love between Christians and Muslims. Okay, so what I just told you, the conquest, the destruction of churches, the slavery, that didn't happen until these evil, crazy crusaders decided to ruin it all and go and just, and until then, Muslims are really upset and have grievances, and they mistrust Westerners because of that. That's complete garbage, of course, because, like I said, right up in the years, aside from what I've been telling you, now in the years before the First Crusade, in the 1050s, 60s, 70s, Asia Minor, what we call now today Turkey or Anatolia, which was, again, one of the most ancient ancient Christian regions, and it was mostly Greeks and Armenians and Syriacs living there. According to the contemporary sources, tens of thousands of them were being butchered and massacred, okay, and hundreds of thousands were being hauled off into slavery by the Turks, the Seljuk Turks. And the churches in Ani, which was the capital of Armenia and was known as the city of 1,001 churches, every single church was desecrated and burned to the ground. Okay, these are the events that Pope Urban II, at the Council of Clermont in 1095, this is the beginning of the First Crusade, that is what he was talking about. And we have it survives in many texts. Okay, he was talking about what Muslims were doing to Christians and to churches, and that's the First Crusade. Okay, but like I said, today it's just always presented in a vacuum as if everything was fine until these evil Westerners decided to go and ruin everything. And that, of course, is done by design and intention to, again, make the victim look like the aggressor, Christians, and to exonerate the aggressors, Muslims.
Well, that's how it's presented in the West, but that's not how it's presented in the Muslim world, because we're all raised on these, we know about all these battles and all these conquests, and we're raised to feel pride over them. So, you know, it's two completely different. Yeah, exactly. These are our bedtime stories, right? This is what everybody's very aware. So for them to over here in the West to pretend that Arabs were just busy, you know, building sandcastles and frolicking in joy before the Crusades is absolutely garbage and untrue. Another point that I wanted to mention was about. So the Hurrain that we mentioned before, they, as you described, their eyes, you know, we get told what their eyes look like, their bosoms look like, and we're also told about their skin. And it talks about how their skin is so white that you can see the veins beneath the skin. And there was a constant obsession with lighter skin, whiter skin. And all of these things that you described, including in there, are white women, Western women, or Christian women being taken as sex slaves in what we now refer to, you know, gloss over it as a euphemism and just call it like harems. But that's what those harems were filled with. They were filled with women who were basically kidnapped, taken as hostages, and enslaved. Were the Crusades a reaction to that as well?
Well, yeah. So what you bring up a very important point, and you know, earlier we were talking about the motivations of the jihad, okay, the plunder, etc. The desire for fair-skinned women goes all the way back actually to Muhammad, and few people know this. So there's in one of the hadith, there's what's called the Tabuk campaign, one of the last campaigns that he went on, which was against the Byzantines, okay, so Greeks, fair-skinned people. And anyway, it never manifested, but before it, there's a hadith where he's trying to cajole a man to come and join the expedition. And he tells him, don't you want the women of yellow, asfar, banu al-asfar, okay, which historians and linguists have translated as meaning either blonde-haired people or pale-skinned people, okay? And the man says something, oh, Prophet of Allah, you know, I have such a weak desire for that, but I don't know if I want to commit, or something to that effect, okay? So it goes all the way back to Muhammad. He used that as an enticement or as a lure that you can conquer and get these fair-skinned, blonde women, okay? And it comes out repeatedly in the sources. Actually, in the book, Sword and Scimitar, I go to some length quoting it. So when they went into Spain, for example, which was then the Visigothic Spain, these were essentially Germanic people. Tariq bin Zayed, who actually is the one, you know, he's the hero of the conquest of Spain. He also cajoled his men by likening them, saying, oh, the women there look like the Houris, and they're waiting for you. They're all just waiting for you, okay? Also, the entire slave trade, okay, a lot of people don't know the Vikings, you know, this is a coterminous with what was happening. The the main years of the Viking attacks on Western Europe, around 800 to 1000 generally, or late 700s. And this coincides, of course, with the Abbasid Caliphate. And a lot of the raids that the Vikings did on, England and in Ireland and northern France and wherever was to get slaves, white slaves, primarily slave women, to sell to the Abbasid Muslim Caliphate because there was a huge demand for that. Okay, and this is one of those things that people don't seem to realize. Okay, so that kind of thing goes on and on repeatedly. It comes out in the early Islamic sources, and it comes out when you read the actual conquest, who was being enslaved and why, and how they boast about, they got fair-skinned people. They went in the 16th century as far to Iceland, Okay, North African Muslims would travel. They attacked Iceland. They attacked Denmark. They had a small island off the coast of England, and it was all dedicated to raiding and taking white slaves and selling them in North Africa on the slave markets. Okay, so this was definitely a real thing. Now, what I also find interesting is in these early Islamic sources, believe it or not, they go out of their way, very lurid and pornographic descriptions of white women, presenting them as inherently promiscuous. Okay, so on the one hand, they present them as very beautiful, and I'm thinking, I actually just made a video about a week ago about this topic on my YouTube channel if anyone wants to see it, but because I have the quote there, you can read it. But one academic says, that they go out of their way to describe these women as beautiful, but then she admits that, but then their characterization of their morals are anything but beautiful. They're very ugly. They present them essentially as harlots who want to do nothing. Even the nuns, Western Christian nuns were all basically whores at heart. And it's very, very pornographic. And I also cite and quote one of the, an eyewitness of, part of Salah ad-Din's entourage during the conquest of Jerusalem. And he has this long quote where he just boasts. It's so sadomasochistic. It's about how all these Frankish white women who are being enslaved because the Muslims won are going to be penetrated. They're going to be crying. Men are going to enjoy them. Really, really, again, if you see the video, I have the whole, and it's in Sword and Scimitar if you want the long graphic excerpt. But what I really find interesting, and the reason I made that video, is the parallels, is the continuity between then and today. Because the reason I did it is today in Europe, especially in England, but all throughout in Germany, there's so many instances of Muslims not only preying on fair-skinned women sexually, but they maintain that same motif, which is you women are good at it. You women are made for this. You are whores. And it goes all the way back, as I'm telling you, to early Islam, including Muhammad. This unwavering continuity. This is where it comes from. And we have anecdotes of this all from Australia and Germany, where Muslim men attack women and say, that's what you're for, et cetera, et cetera. So the female thing is a very real thing. It goes all the way back. It's in the scriptures themselves. It manifested itself all throughout history, and it's still happening till this very day. The difference, of course, being Westerners are inviting it and welcoming it, whereas at least their ancestors would fight against it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. 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 Yes, absolutely agree with you. Thank you for showing us that common thread, which is, a very important one, especially post October 7th, and knowing about all of the Pakistani rape gangs all over England, for example. Like there are a lot of, like, as you mentioned, we can definitely see the clear continuity. Let's continue down that path a little bit more and find some more threads that we can, show how from the beginnings of Islam to today, the same patterns keep repeating themselves to see the continuity. So if we go back to Hijra, for example, or whatever it is, I mean, you have been studying, you refer to primary sources in Arabic, Greek, and other languages to conduct your research. You've been studying these battles between Islam and the West for so long. So what do you see as how these battles inform your understanding of what we're facing today? So what are some glaring similarities that you find happening today where you're like, oh my gosh, history truly does repeat itself?
Can you hold that thought? And I think to help enrich your question, I'll just finish the history thing because I'm almost done. I think
of course.
I left off with the Crusades or something. No, it'll take 5 minutes because it'll help.
Mm-hmm.
It'll help clarify because it's closer to our time. So I think I was talking about the First Crusade. Now forget about the Crusades and the rise of the Ottomans. Now it's and this is an important point that I think I make in the book, and I think people need to understand, which is historically, so as we mentioned, first you have the Arabs, right? And they're the Muslims. And then you get the Turks. And then you get, the Mongols. People forget about the Mongols, but a significant portion of them became Muslims. Okay, they're the Stan nations today, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and those regions which are Muslim. What's interesting is, these are all different peoples from different, epochs of time, different eras, different centuries. They spoke different languages, had their own cultures. and so forth. And yet you find the same unwavering mentality and modus operandi of operation, okay, which is based on Islam and based on the Jihad and based on the Quran. So my point is, you have these various iterations of different peoples, and yet they all acted the same way. Okay, and when you read modern histories, this doesn't come out. What they do is they'll talk about Arab conquests. They won't mention Islam. They'll talk about the Turkic conquests, and then they'll talk about the Mongols. And you won't understand that there's a common thread to all three, which is Islam. Because they'll sidestep the religious issue, and they'll just make it, they always focus on it from a national prism. Okay, so the Turks are a people, the Mongols are a people, Arabs, etc. And I've always found it fascinating that despite that fact, they all acted in the same exact way. They all quoted the same Islamic scriptures and rationale for jihad and conquest. So I think I find that very fascinating. So now we're talking real quickly about the Turks and the Ottomans. And now these guys go into the Balkans. They conquer Constantinople finally in 1453. And it's in my book, actually, chapter, I think 6 or 7. The atrocities committed just boggle the mind, okay, of what happened in Constantinople on May 29th, 1453. And one of the reasons that we know all this is actually because it's not so far. 1453 is a lot closer than 732. Okay, but I believe they were all always as horrific and as sadistic as comes out in 1453. But after that, think about it. Again, under this jihadi imperative, they conquered the Balkans, Greece, all those regions. Albania became Islamized, and it's today, I think it's half Muslim, for example, as well as these other Serbian regions. And they went all the way. Hungary was conquered for about 150 years. Vienna was attacked twice, the Holy Roman Empire capital at the time, in 1529 and again in 1683. Now look at that, 1683. This is 1,000 years now after the first attack on Christian civilization. And at that time, you had something like 200,000 jihadis encircle Vienna. Okay, and there's a reason why Eastern European countries are a little more wary of Islam as opposed to Western European countries. And it's because this history is not so far away from them. It's a recent memory, and they know this. And then they see the continuity when Muslims come into Western Europe, and they behave in the same sort of way. So one understands why that is the case. But so this continues until even America. So, Americans don't realize that America's first war as a nation, once it became a nation after the Revolutionary or War of Independence, was against Muslims who were thinking and acting the same exact way. The Barbary Wars, as we call them. And again, when you hear about Barbary Wars, the way it's presented, it's just a bunch of pirates in North Africa, and they don't really talk about the religion. But we know that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, so what was happening before that is these pirates, Barbary pirates, Muslims, were attacking and invading American vessels after they gained independence because they were no longer being protected by Britain. And they were enslaving their crews and torturing them and killing them. And finally, long story short, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams met one of their ambassadors. And he said, we've done nothing wrong to you. We can be friends. We can trade. Why are you attacking us? And the ambassador quoted essentially a paraphrase of Quran 9:5, which I told you is Sayf, Ayat al-Sayf, the sword verse. And he said, because according to our book and our prophet, all of those who reject our authority, meaning who are not Muslim, are enemies, and it's our right to attack, kill, plunder, and enslave them. And if we die, we go to heaven. Okay? And eventually that led to the first war that America had as a nation. Okay? And how many people know that? So now we're in the year 1800. Okay? We started in the 600s. Now we're 12 centuries into it, and it's the same jihadist imperative and motivation being quoted verbatim, okay? And yet we're told, no, this is all wrong. Okay, so now let's fast forward to the modern era. ISIS, the Islamic State and the other radical organizations, they come on the scene and they start doing what they're doing. And everyone tells us, oh, they've hijacked Islam. This is not Islam. Islam does not do that. Actually, they have modeled themselves perfectly in lockstep with the caliphates that I'm talking about, because they were all governed and functioning under Islamic law, Sharia, in the jihadist worldview, and this is how you treat the infidel. They are actually the most accurate representatives of historical Islam when Islam is strong, okay? And we've been told, no, they're not. And in many ways, that is the grand conclusion of my book, Sword and Scimitar. It shows you the history. And then we get to, these crazy terrorists who have nothing to do with Islam. And you find that they're the perfect copy of what the history has actually shown. Okay. So I think I'll stop the historical thing there, and we can continue on what other questions you had, I think. What are the parallels today? I
Yeah.
think. And so
Yeah.
I'll answer that. And the
Okay.
parallels today, here's the parallels are this, and I call it Islamic continuity versus Western confusion. Okay. Muslims are still acting on the same playbook. Okay. But by and large, Islam is much weaker than the West, much weaker than most of the world. This is the irony. Okay. Islam inherently is not economically or militarily or technologically anywhere near advanced as most of the rest of the world, especially the West. So the strategies, the struggling, the striving, the jihad has taken on different forms. All right. And at the same time, what's happening is because the West is so amnesiac and doesn't know any of this and goes out of its way to present Muslims as victims. If anything, it was evil Christians, evil Europeans who actually were attacking and hurting Muslims. So they are so naive that they are, the Muslim jihad or jihad or struggle that I mentioned earlier, they are susceptible to it. So they bring them into Europe by the millions, and the demographic jihad goes on, the baby jihad. Look at all these countries in Western Europe, or especially the major capitals. The number one name of newborn baby boys is Muhammad. Isn't that just amazing thinking about that? And so that's just one example. This sort of, and it's the Hijra. They're migrating. They're not assimilating. They're creating their own enclaves. And what does the Western authorities do? They're kowtowing to them and giving them more of what they want. And when the native populations of Europe complain, they shut them down. In the UK or in Britain, I think if you say what I'm saying, you will go to jail. Okay, doesn't matter if it's true. So that's the strange, state of affairs. On the one hand, Muslims, like I say, they're behaving the way Islam has always behaved. There's no surprise here. It's what the West is doing, okay, and what the West is allowing. I liken it to the idea, if I put if you put a lion, if I take a lion, he's in an enclosure, and I throw in a bunch of zebras, and then the lion kills the zebras, who's at fault? Is it the lion or me?
Yeah.
And so I think to a large extent, a lot of the people, especially in Europe, need to understand the real problem is not the Muslims. It's the people who are bringing them in and empowering them and allowing this to happen. Because the Muslims are not coming waving swords like they did before and forcing their entry. They are being brought in by the people who govern you and who are supposedly representing you. And it's high time they open their eyes and understand that this isn't just naive politicians or politically correct politicians. There's an agenda, obviously, here. And the longer they wait, the worse it's going to be, or harder it's going to be to ameliorate it.
Yeah. And exactly what you described to us at the very beginning here with, from Mecca to Medina, and how Muhammad was preaching very gently, very, kumbaya, everything was fine and dandy, let's all be friends and brotherhood, until he got to a certain amount of power. So until his number grew to a certain amount, and that's very critical, because that's when things switch. That's when he changed. And that's really important for us to recognize that we can see that happening already all across Europe and the West, and obviously in India and all over the world, where you can see that there's a certain amount of this appeasement goes on for a while until it gets to a certain demographic number. Whereas you talked about all the different ways of jihad, they don't have to come in wielding swords. They can come in wielding, four pregnant wives. You know what I mean? That there's other ways to change the demographics and to make it more, to give Muslims more of a control over the politics, really, as a voting power. So yeah, I think that all of those points you described are very clear. Thank you so much, Raymond, for everything. You have really, really succinctly and very poignantly clarified everything over the 1400 years. It was really amazing. Thank you so much.
Well,
I'm
it's
going
my
to move
pleasure. Thank you.
now. Thank you. I'm going to move into the questions from our audience. The first one, there's actually two different questions, but I'm going to combine them into one. One person was asking about this, how Muhammad died, and another person was asking about did he name a successor when he died? So those are two very big questions, especially the second one. So what can you tell us about that?
The Islamic narrative that he died is, I think he just like he got sick of some stomach flu and died. But then there's conspiracy theories that say he was poisoned, and I believe some say his young wife Aisha. But this might be part of the Shia-Sunni conflict. It
Yeah.
might be an accusation, so I don't know. But I don't think we really know. But in the standard Islamic narrative is just he just. I mean, because in that day and age, if he's born in 516, he would have been 62. So after a lifetime of warfare, it's not uncommon to die in the 7th century at that age. But I think the sources are not clear. It's just essentially ascribed to just some sickness that he got. What was, I'm sorry, the second question?
Did he name a successor?
Um,
The
I
whole
believe
Sunni
this,
Shia split.
this is the whole Sunni Shia problem. Okay, it
Mm-hmm.
depends on who you ask, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Sunnis would say yes, that he allotted it to Abu Bakr, who was his father-in-law and friend, the father of Aisha, who I just said some said poisoned him. Interesting. So he became the actual leader. But of course, to the Shia, they said no, it has to be a descendant of Muhammad, which at the time would have been a child of Fatima, his daughter, married to his cousin Ali. Okay, and so again, hence the Shia Sunni conflict. So these are the kind of questions. It depends on who you're going to ask, and
Mm-hmm.
but most people, even I think Shias, would agree that it was okay to have successors at the time, including Abu Bakr. It's fine. The split becomes later after the Uthman, and then this is when the big the battle in 680 that happens, and then the Shias are killed, and Ali and so forth. So it depends on the version, but it's a very contentious question amongst
Mm-hmm.
Sunnis and Shias.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And the next question is there a proper, trustworthy translation of the Quran into English?
Huh. Now that's a good question, and I'll tell you this: the newer they are, the worse they are. Okay, and
Yeah.
the things they do, the liberties they take to soften it. So for example, I think I quoted 929, Quran 929, which says, "Fight the people of the book, Christians and Jews, until they become Muslim or pay tribute, feeling themselves humbled." Now they'll say something like, "Fight the people of the book who fight you first." Okay, that's not in the Arabic. Sorry, no Muslim has ever believed that. So actually, the one that I like, which is decent, and it's actually online. I can pull it up. Yeah, I think it's just Quran.com,
Yeah.
Quran. It's the international version. And at least they're honest enough to, when they put the soft stuff, they put it in brackets,
Mm-hmm.
implying that, so they're saying that's the implication, but it's not in the Arabic. The reality is it's not even the implication. Okay. It's not in the Arabic, and it's not in the implication. So this is a real problem. And if anything, it's sad to say, but the old Orientalist translations would be more accurate, even though they're very now they would be laughed off as, oh, these guys had a chip on, they had an axe to grind against Islam is the idea, thanks to Edward Said. But actually they would be closer than the stuff I had in Oxford. It was sent to me to review an, I think, Oxford Quran, and it was just like, what am I reading? The Bible? Is this the New
Whitewashing.
Testament?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
Yeah, totally, totally whitewashed. There's more brackets than there are
yeah,
actual.
actual words, right?
Yeah. All right. So, next question. As a scholar of religion, what are some of the common apologetics you get from people trying to explain away the connections between Islam and the issues that it faces with modernity?
I'm not fully following the question. Like, how do Muslims apologize for their behavior?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you've spoken quite a bit about this actually. So, what are the common apologetics you get from Westerners who
Oh,
try to explain to you that this connection between Islam and its issues with living in
yeah.
democratic nations, like, no, it's all in your head, kind of thing? Like,
Yeah,
what are the excuses that they use?
one of the strongest, I guess, is they'll, and this is again why I wrote Sword and Scimitar, is because up until then, people on our camp would argue and say, look at the Quran. It's violent, it's intolerant, etc. That was the main weapon, okay? It wasn't the historical argument. And the response to that was basically, well, look at the Bible, look at the Old Testament, and just because it says violence doesn't mean people are going to follow violence. And there's different interpretations. And they would talk about, the peaceful verses from Mecca and say, well, even if the Medina one says that, there's still the Meccan one. They don't know about abrogation. And if they do, they ignore it. So, and if you're a superficial observer, these are compelling arguments again, because like I said, the Old Testament is probably more violent than the Quran, if we want to be honest. The warfare that goes on, but we already know Christians who believe in the Old Testament and Jews are not necessarily quoting it and going to war anymore. And so, if you have that in the back of your mind, and then a Muslim says, "Well, the Quran's the same thing." And a lot of them, they'll even make the argument and say it was temporary. This applied to the wars back then. But I've actually done a whole study about 2 decades ago to show how the language is different because it's open-ended. Whereas when you read the wars of conquest for Joshua's time, it's very temporal. It names the enemies. There are people who don't exist, Jebusites and etc. anymore. And it's a located, fixated time. You're warring with them. It's not an open-ended command. But the Quran, it doesn't mention, fighting Roman Byzantines. It doesn't say fighting Persians. It says you're fighting the kuffar, the infidels who are still us and who are still alive. Okay, so that's a subtle but I think important distinction. But I think that's been the main one, which is basically just because a book says something doesn't mean it's adherence. They'll say, well, the Old Testament says shellfish, you're not supposed to eat it. Everyone eats it now. So that's why I wanted to write Sword and Scimitar, because this history was hidden, and I wanted to show that, okay, well, let's see how Muslims have behaved. And lo and behold, when it comes to the doctrine of jihad, it manifested itself over and over and over, century after century, until it literally, I don't think I said this, but if you look at the map of what was once the Christian world, it swallowed up almost 3/4. Okay, how many people know that? That the 3/4 of the original Christian territory was permanently conquered and Islamized by Muslims. And this, like I said, the Middle East, which we just casually say, oh, the Muslim world, that was the heart of Christendom. Egypt and all of North Africa and Syria, as well as Asia Minor, Turkey, okay, all of that. So I think that's why, to me, the historical argument is a little more ironclad, because how can you respond to that? The facts are there. They said it, they conquered, they quoted the Quran and the Hadith. They called it a jihad. It was warfare. There was slavery. They were preying on the white women, etc., destroying churches. So it's, I think, a lot harder to get beyond that, whereas it's easy to do the scriptural, oh, okay, just because some musty old book says that doesn't mean every Muslim's living by it.
So, Raymond, these next questions are not asking you historical questions. They're asking you to just give your own insights and your own opinions on things. So one question is there any hope that some Muslim countries will move away from these violent tendencies? Maybe the more secular Central Asian republics, such as Azerbaijan and Albania. Do you see any of these countries moving away from this anytime soon?
I would say certainly some countries are worse than others. Okay. I would rather be living amongst Albanian Muslims than living around Saudi Muslims. Okay. Yeah. There's no denying that. But I think the real question is, can you be a Muslim and do away with what we're talking about? Because of course there's nominal Muslims who don't do this, who don't believe this, who don't know about it. Just like there's nominal Christians and Jews who don't know anything about their religion. So, but is that really a reflection of the religion? And I think that's the question. Where, it's one thing to be, okay, I'm a casual Muslim, and I don't know much about this, and I live like a secular person, okay? And it's another thing to say I'm an observant Muslim, but I've rejected this. I think that's a lot harder to do, because it's just there. It's part of your religion. I don't know how it's actually it's more sincere and honest for you to apostatize and just leave the religion than to play this little game. Yeah, you know what I mean? And so this is why, yeah, you can apostatize, you can be secular and not even know much about your religion. But but the idea that no, I'm a pious Muslim and I read the Quran and I pray, but I don't believe these things, I find that rather suspect.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, next question. Can Raymond address how Islamists infiltrate social justice movements and lie in order to gain support from leftists? The lying, from what I understand, is allowed within the faith if it's done in the name of the struggle. Can he explain the concept of taqiyya?
Taqiyya. I'm the guy who actually wrote the book on Taqiyya because I've been writing about it for one of my oldest articles, which was published by Jane's of Jane's Analyst in the Middle East Quarterly almost 18 years ago, was all about Taqiyya. And Taqiyya is, it might be too complicated to get into this, but the long and short of it is, yes, it allows lying. And it's in its original manifestation, it was based on you're afraid you're going to get killed by the infidel, so you're going to lie to him. But it's really morphed, and there's all other doctrines which, like I think the question was implying, basically you can lie just to empower Islam, as long as it's the end justifies the means. And if the end is I'm going to empower Islam over the world of the kafir, okay, then it's legit. Muhammad, just because because a poet, a Jewish poet, Ka'b or Ashraf bin Ka'b, I believe, and this is again during the Medina times. He didn't believe that Muhammad was a prophet, and he mocked him, and he made poetry mocking him. And so one day came, and Muhammad threw his hands up and said, "Who will rid me of this man?" And a young Muslim follower came and said, "I'll do it, but I need to lie to him." And Muhammad said, "Do it." And the young man went and basically pretended that he apostatized. He's no longer with Muhammad. He hates Muhammad. He agrees with Ka'b. And until Ka'b the Jewish poet dropped his guard and took him as a friend. And before you know it, he appeared with another Muslim saying he's also an apostate. And then they just beheaded him and took his head and threw it to Muhammad, and everyone screamed Allahu Akbar. Okay, so there was a perfect example of deception just to avenge the prophet on someone who mocked him. Okay, so the lying, especially if you can rationalize it in your mind, you as a Muslim, that it's somehow benefiting Islam, or even if it's benefiting you as a Muslim over a non-Muslim, that's the same thing. Okay, then it's legit. And there's all kinds of other doctrines we can talk about that do that. I don't know if that was the whole
That was
question is about
perfect.
Taqiyya. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, that was great. So now somebody's asking about the concept of the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, pre-Islamic ignorance. So amongst the more tribal Arabs, you had civilizations like the Nabateans who treated slaves and women much better than Muslims did. And women were empowered, like Khadija, for example. And so, didn't Islam really devolve, even the Arabs themselves? Did you find that looking through history, that Islam actually devolved them in these social issues?
Yeah, and it goes back to the idea that, again, remember, Muhammad, how is he going to aggrandize and empower himself? He needs manpower. So how is he going to cajole and entice and win over men? He's going to give them whatever they want, which would, of course, mean female concubinage and slavery and a degradation of women, plundering, killing, etc. It was all justified, like I said. The Quran talks about, you can have 4 wives, and as many as your right man, malakat aymankum, whatever your right hand possesses, which means limitless slave women. Okay, so I think because, Muhammad's whole, again, modus operandi is to empower himself, which in the 7th century meant I need followers with swords, as many as I can get, men, of course. So, everything was done. The message given to them was always, the message that would satisfy and gratify the most primordial urges of men, which just so happened not to coincide with women's welfare.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So going back to your those common threads that you were showing us, a lot of people in the chat now are asking about more more contemporary things that are happening right now, especially in American politics. So looking at Mamdani in New York, for example, are you seeing that his actions or what are you seeing for the way he's acting and the way he's succeeding? Are you finding that he's also using these typical playbooks that you've been describing to us?
Well, first I'll tell you, I admit a little ignorance. I haven't been following him too much, but I think I can associate it with a previous question, which is how are the Muslims sort of appropriating and making use of the useful idiots on the woke left? And I think that's what he's basically doing. All his talking points are something that works with the woke left. And when it comes from a brown Muslim, the way Americans see it, then well, he's a victim anyway too, and he's someone who knows what he's talking about, and we can support him. But this idea of actually garnering sympathy from the left, it actually goes back into Al-Qaeda. In 2005, the book was published in 2007, my first book, The Al-Qaeda Reader. And I showed how the Al-Qaeda leadership, Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, their Arabic writings towards Muslims was like ISIS. Okay, these are the infidels, we hate them on principle, etc. Their writings and communiques all to the West, which BBC and CNN love to quote, were all played on leftist themes. Okay, you are the aggressor, you're unjust, capitalism is bad, you're exploiting us. It was all you're racist, you're attacking us because we're brown. That's actually all the stuff that Al-Qaeda would say. And if people wanted to believe it was one thing, but then that was the whole point. I found their writings in Arabic to fellow Muslims, and it was the opposite. It literally said, it doesn't matter what they do, if they're good or bad towards us. They're the enemies. They're the kafir. So back to that mentality. So I think the man you just mentioned in New York is doing the same exact thing, probably in a more suave way from the little I've seen about him. And they're just eating it up because they know how to. Believe it or not, Osama bin Laden at one point was complaining about how America wouldn't sign the Kyoto Protocol for the environment. Okay, so if you want to talk about leftist talking points, they know how to. They know. Ayman Zawahiri once did a whole message directed at the American African Americans, telling them white people will always hate you. The only religion for you is of freedom and equality is Islam. Yeah, so they definitely understand that, and they do press on those particular buttons.
So I'm going to ask you one more question here that I actually just thought of when you were speaking now, which you talked when you were talking about the slave trade and women and stuff. We didn't talk about the Arab slave trade in general and how it obviously predates the European slave trade, and it continued much further after the West stopped enslaving people. So can you talk to us a little bit about that history? Because I think that's very not well known at all. In fact, Malcolm X went to Saudi Arabia as a Muslim while Saudi Arabia was still buying and selling Black human beings as slaves. He went there to talk about how his roots are in Islam and how the white man is the devil. And he's saying this in a country that's currently engaged in slavery. So I think there's a real distortion of, historical revisionism. So can you talk to us a bit about the Arab slave trade?
Sure. So the Arab slave trade was a real thing, and it was a very major thing, and it went on. It went on until the West forced them to stop. Okay.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Arabs, it was, of course, Muslims in general, but usually the periods we're looking at, of course, was during the Arab hegemony, but also the Turks later on, and the Mongols, actually. So, for example, the Mongols, and the problem is the numbers of how many are kind of hard to come across simply because Westerners went out of their way to record numbers. Muslims didn't. It wasn't something that, and even if they did, they're not going to go around and show it right now. But we do come across numbers here and there. And in Sword and Scimitar, I actually have a chapter where I talk about the Slavs, which is where we get the word slaves, because they were being enslaved so much by the Muslims, and also the Mongols, the Tatars, who were Muslim at the time, especially the Russians. So you had the Crimean Khanate, which had, I quote a number in it, I think something like 4 million Russians and Slavs were enslaved through it. The Ottomans, we come across various raids, and I have them in the book. They attacked Hungary and came back with 100,000 slaves or something like that. They attacked Romania and came back with 40,000 slaves. Okay, you get that number. I do know for a fact that according to an American historian who wrote a whole book about this. It's called, I think, Muslim masters, white slaves. And he says that in the 16th century alone, there were 1.2 million white slaves just in North Africa. When I was talking about, remember, they went to Iceland and Denmark to get white slaves, 1.2 million. Okay. And so this goes on now. And then the sub-Saharan, the African slave trade, that was also a major thing. But a very interesting point is, and I don't know the exact details, but I've read this, which is, in America, you had black slaves, but, not only did they continue to live on, we have the descendants, but to a great degree, a lot of them are mixed a little bit with, the whites. If you look at the DNA, they say today of the Arab world, where there were countless slaves, there is no African DNA, because they would either turn them into eunuchs, okay, take their testicles away, or just, outright kill them. But there was no mixture, no nothing. So that's why, in other words, I think you would, if you were a black slave, you believe it or not, you would better off in America than under Islam. Okay, something maybe Malcolm X should have been cognizant of. So anyway, this kind of thing goes on. But first of all, it's in their Quran, so it's legitimate. So until today, it is legitimate, which is why ISIS enslaved who they enslaved. Okay, and when did it end? It ended when Western colonial powers forced Islamic nations to stop. And until today, it continues underground, wherever they can get away with it, because it's part of their teaching. And yet, you talk today to your average Westerner, who started slavery, who's the bad guy? White people, Europeans. Yeah. They're the source of slavery, even though they're the ones who actually put an end to slavery. So this is the topsy-turvy world we're currently living in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. They forced them to stop slavery, but as you said, it still continues underground. But essentially, the Brits told the Saudis, "We're not going to help you. Get your oil out of the ground until you stop buying and selling human beings." Okay, I'm going to ask you this final question, and then I'll let you go. How do you think the history of the Christian West, particularly the downfall of the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago, influences the way we learn history? Have the winners taken their success for granted and wrote out the parts where they were the victims? So as you spoke earlier, you said the Islamic world is actually very weak in comparison to the West. And so do you think that contributes? Is it kind of like an arrogance or a underestimating the enemy kind of thing going on?
I would say definitely there was a lot of arrogance in its origins, kind of seeing, because a lot of this comes from, finally Europe became ascendant, and this is in the colonial era, which is basically around 1800 up until, 19, whatever, 30s, 40s, you can say 50s. And what happens is this is when Europe is powerful and it's in Islamic lands. So for some reason, historians, this is all they think about. I read a book and I've critiqued it. It's called Jihad and Crusade. The book's 1,000 pages, and the subtitle is 1,000 Years of War between Christians and Muslims. It sounded like my book. That's why I had to review it. Guess what? It's 1,000 pages. The first 30 pages deal with the centuries that I discussed, which is from the beginning of the Jihad in the 7th century until the colonial era. 1,000 years are just in 30 pages. Then the rest of those 800 pages are all about the colonial era. And they go into extreme detail to show you how Muslims are upset by that, how, evil the Europeans were. So definitely that's part of the framework. The people, their brain just goes to the colonial era. They don't remember the other over 1,000 years that happened, which was the exact opposite. But today, I believe it's reached the point where it's intentional. Okay, now it's, presenting the aggressors as the victims and the victims as the aggressors. This is obvious. It's too flagrant that it can't be that people, it's intentional. A lot of it is coming from Saudi Gulf money that goes to all these Ivy universities, Georgetown, Harvard, Princeton. Okay, it's intentional. They're being bribed. So it's because it's just too extreme. It's too topsy-turvy. This can't be a coincidence anymore. And especially when a person like me, I'm the one who's sort of changing the narrative, and I'm being attacked. There was an incident a while back. I was invited by the U.S. Army War College, and CARE and all sorts of leftist groups tried to shut it down because I'm speaking history, and they don't want history to come out. And eventually they failed, but the War College did buckle until people protested. So, there's definitely a war against historical truth.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. There's billions and billions of dollars being pumped into American universities from Qatar. In fact, when you take a look at the data on foreign funding, you'll find that Qatar is number one by multitudes behind
Yeah.
or ahead
Yeah.
of the next one in
Yeah.
line, which is unfortunately China, which is also bad news. So
Why
I
would
just
why
really
would
want to.
these why would authoritarian Islamic nations spend millions to sponsor the liberal arts in America? Are they really
Exactly.
so interested in making, or do they actually have an agenda and a narrative that they're pushing on people?
Yeah, of course. When I was speaking at Harvard University, the building that I was speaking in was called the Sharia Institute of Harvard. So there's a photo of me under this big, beautiful plaque that says Sharia Institute of Harvard. It was absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, I mean they're going to take the money if it's being given to them, but it's not being given to them without
Yeah.
you know, expectations in return. And so, yeah, we saw this on October 7th, how successful their infiltration of our universities over the past few decades, how successful it's been. And unfortunately, we're now having to deal with the consequences of that. So thank you so much, Raymond. You really did an amazing job of bringing us all the way from the very beginning of Islam all the way up to today. My next guest is going to be Raheel Raza, who's going to pick it up from exactly where you've left off here, and she's going to talk about what happened in the Muslim world now when well, I guess we should call it the past Christian world, when we're talking about Muslims versus Islamists, because today we've been talking a lot about political Islam, and these are now referred to as Islamists. And then there's, of course, Muslims who are people who are born and raised and believe all of these things, but some of them don't necessarily want to spread Islam in the same way that Islamists do. So we have to be very careful to recognize the difference and to not confuse the two, because people love to say, well, this is, religious freedom and we have to let them be, and they should be able to do whatever they want, when in actuality, that's not the truth at all. It's not religion, it's not faith. This is a political ideology, and their goal is a global caliphate. So we'll get more on that from Raheel in the next episode. But Raymond, before I let you go, I just want to make sure that you have shared everything with us that you wanted to share with us, that there isn't, something you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask you about, any parting words of wisdom to us, or let people know where they can follow you or learn more from you. Tell us where they can learn about you.
Sure. My one-stop site is my website, raymondibrahim.com, RaymondiBrahim.com. And also I've started a YouTube channel. It's rather modest, but I've started using that medium to get across to Gen Z and so forth, because they don't want to read. And it's easier anyway. So you can check me out on YouTube as well. And on my website, there's links to YouTube as well as my social media, most of which I'm shadow banned on, except I suppose Twitter. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, and I've heard really great things about your YouTube page. Lots of people have been promoting it, and lots of people have been recommending it. So I'm going to go check it out. Thank you so much again for all of your knowledge, sharing it with us today. We really appreciate you so much.
My
Take
pleasure,
care.
Yasmine. Thanks for having me. And good luck
Thank
with the
you.
rest of your series.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Bye, everyone. After hearing all that, you might be left wondering, what can I do? How can I help? Well, this is why I created a nonprofit called Free Hearts, Free Minds. We are the only organization dedicated exclusively to helping these free thinkers. We empower them with our programs and supportive community, lifting them up so they can heal, speak out, and begin to make positive changes, not just in their own lives, but within the broader community around them. If this is a cause that resonates with you and you want to make a difference, one way to do that is by donating to Free Hearts, Free Minds. Because not enough people care about this cause, we need people like you to help fuel this change. You can donate via our website,
freeminds.com. Thank you. Every dollar you donate makes a difference.